Good morning. Glad to see everyone here this morning. Glad to see we're having rather decent weather outside this morning, and the snow didn't stick around very long. This morning we're going to talk about types, antitypes. And I've spoke on those before, and I really enjoy the types and antitypes that we can read about in Scripture. It's a foreshadowing of things to come, with the type that we find in the Old Testament, with the antitype which we find in the New. We studied on them as far as Joseph and the similarities between his life and Jesus, the ark and the church. That is a type and antitype. We know from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21 that baptism is an antitype, which now saves us, talking about the ark and those saved through the water. But this morning we're going to talk about Moses and the antitype of Jesus. So we're going to compare kind of similarities between Moses and Jesus. I come across this in a issue of House to House, Heart to Heart. I found it interesting. I hope you do as well. God is all-knowing. He has an omniscient power. He knows all. And as we know, we talked about this morning, God's plan, when He puts a plan into effect or puts a plan into motion, it's perfect. There's no flaws in His plan. So we can see that God puts in a foreshadowing of future events into His plan. We're going to talk about that this morning. Moses is very often mentioned in the Old Testament scriptures. Over 700 times is his name mentioned in the Old Testament. And he is the most mentioned Old Testament character in the New Testament at about 80 times. So he is very well known, in Scripture. Now, where we start this morning is both Moses and Jesus, at the time when they were infants, they were threatened with murder. Both of them went through a very troubling time, or there was a very troubling time when they were born, where the infants were being killed. We know from Exodus chapter 1, verses 16 and verse 20, that Pharaoh put out a decree. In verse 16, he said, "When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." In verse 22 of chapter 1, it tells us that Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born to you you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save. And we know the story of how Moses was saved through that time. But Jesus had a very similar time frame when he was born. At that time, in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, we know that they departed. We know an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him." A decree was put out to destroy and kill all the young male children. So this is something that they both had in similar at their infant stages. We know that Jesus stayed there until the death of Herod, because it fulfilled the prophecy, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Out of Egypt Jesus came. Both Moses and Jesus both fasted for 40 days. Moses, when he was on the mountain with God, Exodus chapter 34 and verse 28 tells us that so he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. And we know that Jesus, when he was in the wilderness, prior to his temptations by Satan, Matthew chapter 4, verse 2, and when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights afterwards, he was hungry. Now, both of these men were able to survive that 40 days without eating. I don't know if you caught it on the news, but just recently, someone had tried to replicate this feat. They didn't make it. They passed before they could complete this. But Moses and Jesus both fasted for 40 days. Both Moses and Jesus performed a miracle with the sea. Scott's trying to get in if somebody wants to get the door for him. Both Moses and Jesus performed a miracle involving water, not just any water, but a sea, a large body of water. Moses parted the Red Sea. We know as the Egyptians were chasing the Israelites who were fleeing, and they were scared. They were, have you brought us here to die? And the Lord commands Moses what he needs to do. So in verse 21 through 22 of chapter 14 of Exodus, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand and to the left. Moses stretched out his hand, and it gave them a corridor through the middle of the Red Sea that they were able to pass through on dry land. Jesus, we know, was on the boat with his disciples, and there was a great storm, and they woke him because they were afraid that they were going to perish. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 26, he says to them, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" And then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. The great calm that existed after Jesus rebuked the wind was equal to the great tumult of the storm that was raging around them. Both of them, Moses and Jesus, both did this miracle on not just a small body of water, but a large sea. Moses and Jesus both fed a multitude. Jesus had multitudes following him all the time. And Moses was with a great multitude of the Israelite people traveling through the wilderness. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 11 through 16, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails come up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, This is the bread which the Lord has given to you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's needs, 1 omer for each person according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent." Manna actually means, what is it? When the dew lifted and they saw this substance on the ground, that was their first question. What is this? It was foreign to them. They didn't know what it was. But it was what was to feed them. It was the manna. Jesus, we see, fed 5,000 people at one time. And then the chapter later, we see him feed 4,000 people. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 through 20. "When it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." So the Israelites, they were worried about having enough to eat. They were worried about starving. And here the disciples are going to Jesus saying, "We don't have enough to feed these people. You need to send them away." They recognize his authority, that if he said, "Everybody depart and go your own way," that they would have listened to him and they would have done so. But Jesus is using this for a teaching moment and showing miraculous powers here. But Jesus says to them in verse 16, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "We only have 5 loaves and 2 fish." That's not very much to feed 5,000 people with. But Jesus is using this for a very important lesson here. Verse 18, he says, "Bring them here to me." Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. So we can learn from this that Jesus blessed the food before they ate it. It's a thing for us to do as we prepare to eat as well, to bless our food. But then he takes the fish and the bread, breaks it, has the disciples disperse it. And it was enough that it fed all of them. And they were able to take up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. That stretched a long way. He also, in Matthew chapter 15, fed 4,000, and that was off of 7 loaves and a few little fish, verse 34. We know it was 4,000 in verse 38 of chapter 15 of Matthew. Now, Moses and Jesus both endured criticism. They both had murmuring from those around them. Moses, we know in chapter 15, verse 24 of Exodus, and the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" They're constantly complaining against him. What are we going to drink? And he's having to deal with this. Jesus was the same thing. It was a constant amount of people coming to him and complaining against him for what his disciples were doing, what he was doing. And these aren't the only examples. These are just the 2 that we picked out. Mark chapter 7, verse 5, and the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" Something so trivial they're complaining at Jesus against. They're murmuring against him. Moses and Jesus both had to endure that. Both Moses and Jesus were discredited by their own family members. Moses by his brother and his sister, Aaron and Miriam. Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. So they're speaking against Moses. They're discrediting him for his decisions on who he married. Jesus by his own people in his own country. Mark chapter 6 and verse 4. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." And we know from John chapter 7 and verse 5, "For even his brothers did not believe him." Even his own brothers did not believe him. Being discredited by your own family is tough. Having people not believe you that are outside of your family is one thing, but having your own family discredit you and not believe you is mentally taxing. Both Moses and Jesus appointed 70 people. Moses appointed 70 elders. Numbers chapter 11, verses 16 through 17. So the Lord said to Moses, "Gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. Then I will come down and talk with you there. I will take the spirit that is upon you, and I'll put the same upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone." So he's gathering up 70 elders to help, 70 assistants. We know from Luke chapter 10, verse 1, that Jesus appointed 70 helpers. After these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place he himself was about to go. That was the limited commission. They were out 2 by 2, 70 of them, 35 groups were sent out to the cities which Jesus was getting ready to go into. Both Jesus and Moses appeared after their deaths. Now, we studied Jesus this morning and his appearances following the resurrection. And when we went through Matthew, we studied Moses' appearance after his death. It was in the garden when he appeared with Elijah. Matthew chapter 17 and verse 3. "And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him." As they appeared with Jesus in the garden, one representing the law, one representing the prophets, God says from a cloud, "This is my son, hear him," saying that Jesus is above the law and the prophets. So Moses had his appearance then in the garden. And we know from what we read this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 through 8, that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. So we have both of these, Moses and Jesus, appearing and being seen by others after their deaths. Both Jesus and Moses are mediators of covenants. Moses of the Old Covenant, the law, Exodus chapter 24, verse 6. "And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, "All that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient." And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words." There we see the law of Moses, the Mosaic covenant, being ushered into effect. And we know that Jesus and his death brought into effect the new covenant that we're under, the law of Christ. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 15 through 20. And for this reason, he, Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of their transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is enforced after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. And we just read that, where Moses used that blood to dedicate the old covenant. For when Moses has spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission. As of now, with the new covenant, there is no remission without the shedding of blood. Jesus had to die on that cross for us to have access to those saving grace for the remission of sins. Both extended God's offer for salvation. Moses in the wilderness was for people that had been bitten by the snake. He offered them to be saved that they might live. Numbers chapter 21, verses 8 through 9, the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live." So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole, and so it was, if the serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. They couldn't just believe that the bronze serpent had been risen up there by Moses. They had to go and do something. They had to go and look upon that bronze serpent that they might live. That in and of itself is a type, with the antitype of baptism we read about later. But they had to go and do something. They had to go look upon this bronze serpent to be able to live. Jesus, on the other hand, doesn't offer a salvation against snake bites. He offers a salvation against sin. That is what his offer from God's salvation is. Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30 tells us, "Come to me, all you who are labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus gave many commandments prior to his ascension, the Great Commission, and we know that he came on this earth for one reason. He came and lived as a man because God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believed on him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. That's something that we can look forward to. John chapter 3, verse 16. Mark chapter 16, verse 16 tells us, "He that believes and is baptized will be saved. He that doesn't believe will be condemned." Those are the words of Jesus. It's an unget-overable fact, an unget-overable wall of evidence that is required. We know that even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 10, "But God demonstrates his own love towards us." That's tying back to John 3:16, "For God so loved the world." Here we see, but God demonstrates his own love towards us, and while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And as we talked about a little bit this morning when we're going through the book of Acts and the establishment of the church and the history of the expansion, only one church exists under the authority of Jesus. And that is his church, the one that Peter talked about, or the one that he told Peter about in Matthew 16:18. "Upon that rock I will build my church." It's his church. It doesn't exist by anybody else's name. It's his. John chapter 14 and verse 6 tells us that Jesus said to him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is the only path, the only one that exists, that we might see eternal life. Now, if there's anyone in the audience this morning, in attendance, that needs anything in the congregation, if you have questions, if you would like a Bible study, if there's anything that you need of the congregation, don't hesitate to make it known. If you have not yet been baptized into Christ, Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, or Galatians 3:27. If you have not yet done that and you would like to make that happen, we can surely make that happen yet this morning. Now is the time. Today is the day of salvation. We're not promised tomorrow. We are but a vapor. We are but a vapor. We're not promised another day. We can do that this morning. If there's anybody that needs anything from the congregation, won't you please come forward as we stand and as we sing the invitation song.